St. Louis, Missouri, June 2, 2014. The Lumiere Place casino never really goes quiet. Not at 2 a.m., not at 5 a.m. There's always a hum, recycled air, artificial light, the electronic chatter of 1,000 machines pretending to be games of chance. Somewhere on that floor, a man in his late 30s stands in front of a cabinet. Unremarkable. Mid-height, dark hair, the kind of face that doesn't register in a crowd. He isn't drinking. He isn't chatting with the dealer. He's just watching his phone. He plays, he wins. Not big, a few $100s at a time. Small enough to stay under the radar. Frequent enough that, if you were the kind of person who reads spreadsheets for a living, it would eventually catch your eye. Nobody in that building knows it yet, but the machine in front of him isn't malfunctioning, and he isn't lucky. He is executing a plan that began 5 years earlier and 5,000 miles away, in an apartment in St. Petersburg, Russia, where a small group of people had quietly done something the gambling industry believed was impossible. They had learned how to predict a machine that was built to be unpredictable. To understand what happened in Missouri, you have to go back to 2009, and to a decision made by a very different kind of gambler, the Russian government. That year, Vladimir Putin, then serving as prime minister, backed a sweeping law that outlawed casino gambling across nearly all of Russia. Officially, the goal was to curb organized crime tied to the gaming industry. Whatever the real motivation, the effect was immediate and strange. Thousands of casinos across the country were forced to shut their doors almost overnight, and they needed to get rid of their equipment fast. Slot machines, expensive, specialized, and suddenly worthless in Russia, were dumped onto the second-hand market for a fraction of their value. Most buyers who scooped them up were looking for cheap furniture for basements or storage. But a small number of buyers saw something else. They saw a circuit board. And circuit boards can be studied. Among those buyers, investigators would later determine, was a St. Petersburg-based organization that didn't just want to resell the machines, it wanted to understand them. Specifically, it wanted to understand the part of the machine that made it a slot machine in the first place, the algorithm that decided who won and who lost. Here is something most gamblers never think about. A slot machine doesn't actually generate random numbers. It can't. Computers, by design, aren't capable of true randomness. They follow instructions. Instead, slot machines rely on something called a pseudo-random number generator, or PRNG. It's a piece of code that starts with a seed value, often drawn from the machine's internal clock, and runs that seed through a mathematical formula thousands of times per second. The output looks random to a human eye. Spin after spin, the numbers seem to have no pattern at all. But mathematically, they aren't random. They're deterministic. If you know the formula the machine is using, and you know its current internal state, you can calculate with real precision what number is coming next, and when. That's the vulnerability the St. Petersburg group found. Not a hack in the Hollywood sense, no breaking into servers, no stealing code off the internet. Just old-fashioned reverse engineering, opening up second-hand cabinets, studying the firmware inside, and mapping out exactly how the PRNG behaved. It took years. By most accounts, the group spent roughly 5 years quietly picking apart the mathematics behind these machines before they had something they could actually use in the field. There was just one problem. Knowing the algorithm wasn't enough. A PRNG's output doesn't just depend on the formula. It depends on the machine's internal state at any given moment, which shifts constantly based on how long it's been running, how many times it's been played, and tiny variances in its internal clock. Two identical machines, sitting side by side, will be in completely different states from one moment to the next. That meant the group couldn't just write one universal formula and walk into any casino in the world. They needed to observe each individual machine in real time, calculate its current state, and only then predict its near-future spins. That required watching the reels, carefully, methodically, machine by machine, without anyone at the casino realizing they were being studied. So they built a system. It was simple on the surface, and quietly brilliant underneath. An operative, a real person, physically present on a casino floor, would use a smartphone to record roughly 20 spins on a target machine. That footage would be transmitted back to a technical team in St. Petersburg. There, analysts would feed the video into custom software that reconstructed the PRNG's internal state and calculated a predictive window, the precise moments, seconds into the future, when the machine's reels were mathematically primed to pay out. Those timings would be sent back to the operative, not as a phone call, not as a text message that might raise suspicion, but as a simple vibration, a silent signal delivered straight into a pocket, telling a man standing at a slot machine exactly when to press the button. He didn't need to understand the mathematics, he just needed to feel the buzz and press. By 2011, casinos across Central and Eastern Europe, many of them running machines made by the Austrian manufacturer Novomatic, began logging strange results. Payouts that were too large, too frequent, statistically implausible. Novomatic's own engineers investigated and found no evidence the machines had been physically tampered with. Nothing had been opened, nothing had been rewired. The only explanation left was the uncomfortable one. Someone, somehow, was predicting the machine's behavior from the outside. The operation didn't stay in Europe. Over the following years, it expanded, reportedly employing dozens of operatives who traveled to casinos across multiple continents, targeting machines in country after country. It became less a single scheme and more an ongoing enterprise. Recruit people willing to travel, hand them a phone loaded with the right software, and send them wherever the next vulnerable machine cabinets could be found. Which brings the story back to St. Louis, and to a man named Murat Bliev. By 2014, the group had reached the United States, targeting a specific model, the Aristocrat Mark VI, a slot machine cabinet widely used across American casinos. On June 2 and 3, 2014, something unusual started showing up in the internal reports at Lumiere Place Casino in St. Louis. In the casino industry, there's a metric called hold percentage. Essentially, the cut the house is mathematically guaranteed to keep over time. For a 2-day stretch, several of Lumiere's machines showed something almost unheard of, a negative hold. The machines were paying out more money than they were taking in, without a single major jackpot being triggered. Casino management investigated. Reviewing surveillance footage, they noticed a man holding his phone unusually close to a machine, watching it intently between spins, waiting, and then playing with a strange, deliberate rhythm. Wins that were frequent, modest, and always conveniently below the $1,200 threshold that would trigger a formal IRS reporting requirement. Investigators pulled rental car records tied to the casino's parking structure and identified the man, Murat Bliev, a Russian national in his late 30s. By the time they had a name, Bliev was already gone. He'd flown back to Moscow on June 6th. Here's the part that would prove to be the operation's first real mistake. Rather than treat the Missouri exposure as a warning sign, the St. Petersburg organization sent Bliev right back into the United States to continue working with a new team. Word of the Lumiere Place incident eventually reached Darren Hoke, at the time a director of surveillance at a casino in Louisiana, who had a reputation for tracking exactly this kind of anomaly across the industry. Hoke began piecing together incident reports from multiple states, cross-referencing patterns, times, and player behavior. What emerged wasn't an isolated scam, it was a coordinated, traveling operation working its way through American casinos, one machine, one city, one payout at a time. By December 2014, Bliev was back on U.S. soil, flying into Chicago before making his way to St. Charles, Missouri, where he met up with 3 other operatives, Ivan Gudulov, Igor Lavrenov, and Yevgeny Nazarov. Together, the 4 planned to hit casinos across Missouri and Illinois over the following days. On December 10th, security at Hollywood Casino in St. Louis spotted Bliev again. The same rhythm, the same telltale posture at the machine. This time, they were ready. All 4 men were arrested. Federal prosecutors charged Bliev, Gudulov, Lavrenov, and Nazarov with conspiracy to commit fraud, accusing them of traveling from Russia specifically to manipulate slot machines across at least 3 states, Missouri, Illinois, and California among them. It was, according to investigators, the first time anyone connected to the St. Petersburg organization had ever stood in an American courtroom. Bliev, Gudulov, and Lavrenov, all Russian citizens, eventually accepted plea deals. Each was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, to be followed by deportation. Nazarov's case played out differently. As a U.S. resident who had been granted asylum, his situation was more legally complicated, and his sentencing dragged on far longer than his co-defendants, a detail that led some investigators to suspect he may have cooperated with authorities in exchange for leniency. What none of the men ever gave up, publicly or in court, was the identity of the people running the operation from St. Petersburg, the engineers who mapped the PRNGs, the analysts who processed the video feeds, the architects of the entire scheme. To this day, no one has been publicly identified, charged, or arrested as the mastermind behind the algorithm itself. The men caught on American soil were the visible edge of something much larger: operatives, not architects. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this story isn't the scheme itself, it's what happened after. Casino manufacturers, including Aristocrat, were left with a deeply uncomfortable reality. The flaw wasn't a bug that could be patched with a simple software update. It was baked into the fundamental architecture of how these machines generated their outcomes. Architecture used across enormous installed bases of machines already sitting on casino floors worldwide. Replacing that infrastructure wholesale would cost the industry a fortune. Security experts who studied the case afterward largely agreed on one grim point: there was no easy technical fix. The vulnerability that a small group of people spent roughly 5 years quietly discovering wasn't going away just because a handful of operatives got caught in Missouri. What makes this story unusual isn't just the mathematics, though the mathematics is genuinely remarkable. A small group of people looking at code most of the world assumed was unbreakable, and simply breaking it, through patience and observation rather than any dramatic act of hacking. What makes it unusual is the shape of the operation itself. Not a single genius working alone in the dark, but a structure. Engineers who never set foot in a casino, and operatives who never understood the mathematics, connected by nothing more than a video file and a vibration in a pocket. The men who went to prison were the only ones anyone ever saw. The people who built the system that sent them there were never in the room at all. Somewhere, the machines that made this possible are likely still running, in casinos that never found out, on floors that never triggered a negative hold, predicted by someone somewhere, still watching.